In this video, I'm going to show you how to build production-level retries for your automations using N8N. But the concepts you learn here are not limited to N8N. You can apply the same principles to almost any automation platform. This is one of the things that separates beginners from professionals. Beginners build workflows that work when everything goes right. Professionals build systems that know how to recover when something goes wrong. And this will be a two-part series. We're going to have two videos. The first video will cover the core concepts, including what retries are, why they matter, which errors should be retried, and the difference between a simple rate node approach and a more production-ready design. Then in the second video, we'll go deeper into more advanced concepts like dead letter handling, idempotency, recovery, logic, and how to safely reprocess failed execution. Make sure you watch until the end because these are the kinds of concepts that will take your automation skills to the next level and help you stand out from the crowd. Why retries matter in production? Retries matter in production because every single workflow depends on services that can fail outside of your control. When you build automations, usually you connect to external systems, right? You connect to CRM, you connect to APIs, etc., etc. And those systems they can rate limit you. For example, if you are making a lot of requests to Cloud API, for example, or OpenAI API, they're gonna temporarily rate limit you, meaning you won't get any response. You're gonna get a 429 status code, and you won't be able to complete the workflow execution. And if you do not have a retry mechanism in place, you're going to lose that execution. And what is supposed to happen, for example, if the idea was to classify a lead and store in the CRM, because the call to Cloud or OpenAI failed, is not going to be able to complete the execution, which means that lead is not going to go to the CRM. And if that keeps happening, imagine from 100 leads, you have 10 leads that didn't land into the CRM. What's going to happen is that this automation is fragile and clients eventually is going to start complaining because they need to be able to trust the automation. They need to see that the margin for errors is not 10%. It has to be a rare thing. And the way you deal with that is by having a retry mechanism. So when, for example, OpenAI or Claude says like, hey, okay, you got to wait a little bit to be able to for us to be able to process this request, then you will have something in place to retry, for example, after 5 seconds, after 10 seconds, etc., etc. That's why retry is very important in every production. When you launch, you build a workflow and you bring it to production, it's very important that you have this retry mechanism in place. And business impact can compound very easily, right? Because a failed run can mean missed leads, duplicates the CRM records, or delayed follow-up, which has sometimes a strong business impact. For example, if one lead, for the business, for example, each lead might lead to a $10,000 job or $20,000 job. If they miss 10 of those leads, that can amount to potential $200,000 of loss because the workflow wasn't built the right way. And that's why it's so important to learn this retry mechanism and have that in your N8N automation or any other platform similar to N8N, or even if you're building custom code, you gotta have this mechanism to recover from failures and retry again after a certain period of time. Another thing with if you don't have this retry mechanism in place is that you're gonna have to retry manually, which does not scale. Imagine that could work for a very small workflow that you can go and manually retry 1 or 2 or 3 leads, but still there's a lot of work because then you got to go into N8N and then retry again, and it's just scalable and that is not efficient because the whole point of automation is to avoid manual work. So the production goal is to build workflows that can pause, retry, recover, and surface and resolve failures without creating duplicates. That's the goal. That's what you need to aim for when bringing a workflow to production. But what retry actually means? So the first thing we need to understand is that retry is a policy, not just a loop. So retry is an attempt that is attempting again when the failure may be temporary, right? For example, let's use again the example of rate limiting. For example, if Cloud is or OpenAI is putting a restriction is rate limiting you, so that's a temporary failure, and eventually if you try later or you give some time, it's going to work. So that's a very good example where you having a retry mechanism is pretty important. So a good retry, how does that look like? A good retry involve limited attempts. Okay, you're not going to retry forever. You're going to retry a certain number of times. You got to put a cap on the number of retries. For example, I'll retry 3 to 5 times, for example, right? And then between each retry, you're going to add a delay because, for example, if the API is rate limiting you, if you keep trying, they're going to keep rate limiting you, and you're going to eventually get blocked. So what you need to do is try once. If it fails, wait maybe a few seconds and then try again. And then if it doesn't work, you give some more time and try again. And then eventually it will work. Most of the times it will work. And you should only retry retriable errors, not all errors you're supposed to retry. Because, for example, if there is the system, if there's an error that a new error that it's like it's permanent error, for example, right? That's not something temporary. You're not going to retry that because it's going to keep failing. For example, let's say you have a bad input, for example. Let's say you were collecting leads and the lead came without email. So it's missing an important field. You're not going to keep retrying that because it's not going to work. This is not a kind of situation where you have a temporary issue. This is a permanent issue. The lead information is incomplete. It's a bad input. So you're not going to keep retrying that. You just going to have to fix that data or store that somewhere to be fixed for a human to review because it's just bad input and there's no point. You're not going to be able to save that in the CRM without an email. So there's no point in retrying. So not all kind of errors is worth retrying. You're not going to retry everything. So just the type of errors that it makes sense to retry. And what a bad retry really looks like, for example, I give the example of bad input. You're trying bad data, doesn't make sense. You just gotta make sure that if there's the problem is the input that it needs to be cleaned up or it's not normalized, you gotta fix that input and there's no point in retrying. And then infinite loops, also it's a problem. You cannot keep retrying forever because that's gonna consume your credits, your workflow credits, eventually you're gonna keep being rate limited. It's gonna create a lot of problems. And if you do not have an alert or audit trail to keep track of the retries and what's happening after you retry, that also it's a bad retry mechanism. And also there's a possibility that you're going to have a duplicate if you do not have the right controls in place. Because if you retry once and it works, and then you don't have a mechanism to detect that it worked, then you keep retrying, then it's going to create duplicates in your CRM or any other external system to where you're sending your data. So the key rule is retry should reduce operational risk, not create more uncertainty. Now, the first thing, as I mentioned before, one of the first things you have to worry about is whether or not that error is worth trying. So you have to classify the error before retrying, because not every failure deserves another attempt. What could be something that you could retry? A temporary issue. If it's a temporary issue, a server issue, or a rate limiting, then it's worth trying again. You can try again to see if it works. Now, if it's bad input, for example, bad configuration, then it's going to fail over and over. So there's no point in trying. And then you have, and some of information that comes in the workflow may need a review, may need a person to decide. Or, for example, you have a workflow that executes, but you only completed partially. So it might be something new happening, and in that case, you need to be able to flag that. And so a human or engineer or a member of the team can go in and check what's going on, why the workflow didn't fully execute complete, just partially. So it might be something new happening that you guys didn't account for. So it's worth bringing in a human to check it out and see what's going on. And again, keep in mind that if you keep retrying the wrong error, it burns executions and hides the actual issue. So what option we have in terms of retry? I'm talking about N8N. In this case, we're going to use N8N as an example, but I believe we can replicate this to other platforms. So in N8N, the simplest option we have is the wait node. The wait node is a node in N8N that you can just use to trigger a delay before you try something, before you go to the next step, right? So you can use wait node in a loop to keep retrying after a number of seconds. And how would that work? For example, the first step is you try the action once. If it succeeds, you continue the workflow. If it fails, you classify the error and see if it's something that should be retried or not. And then you have the wait node to trigger the delay. Like, for example, wait for 5 seconds. And then it calls the action again. It executes the action again. For example, if you're trying to using an HTTP node to save a record in the CRM, and if it fails, you will wait 5 seconds, and then it's going to try again to execute that HTTP node and try to save the record in the CRM. And if, for example, it's something that it's not retriable, or for example, you reach the max attempt, you have to have a way to flag that, store that somewhere, or send alert someone in the user Slack or any other notification system to say, hey, this workflow failed. It didn't execute, so check it out, right? But this would work on for low risk temporary errors, like smaller workflows where maybe missing a lead or two is not a big of a deal. But for production level workflows, I would suggest a different approach. But if you want a quick solution, the wait node is one way you could do it, right, in N8N. So again, the wait node approach, it has its limitations. It works, but it's not always enough for production recovery. Why? Because first thing, the state of the execution stays, it stays inside. The status of the execution, the workflow execution, it's internal, meaning if you don't save that information, you don't persist that information somewhere else. If it crashes, right, you have no way to go back and say, oh, this lead with this email or this workflow with execution ID X failed, so try again. So you need a way to be able to persist the execution log, so you are able to kind of backtrack and see which workflow failed and then which workflow needs to be retried again. But with this wait node, you're not going to be able to do that because it's all inside the workflow. If the workflow crashes, that's it. You lose that element, that execution, and you don't have a way to go back and find out what exact workflow failed. And also, it gives you weak operational visibility. You know the workflow failed, but you don't know when to retry or what action is needed. And manual review is harder, of course. And a retry may repeat a step that already partially succeeded. So it's not the best approach. It works for very smaller workflow. I mean, if you're trying something or it's a low risk automation, but for most of production level automation, we should go with the next option that I'm going to talk about now, which is database backed recovery ledger. This is the actual production level retry mechanism. How it would work. So, for example, incoming item creates a ledger rows. For example, you're going to have a database in N8N. For example, you can use that data table, and inside the data table, you can create a bunch of columns to track each workflow execution, right? So when the workflow starts, it creates a row in that table, and he marks the status as processing, for example, and then he tries, for example, the HTTP call. He runs the action. If succeeds, he marks the row as success. So the status of the execution changes to success. If it fails, then he checks if the error is worth retrying. If it is, and then it's going to schedule the next retry. For example, you might say, okay, next retry in 10 seconds, for example, and all that is going to be on the database table, right? So we have a clear log. We are persisting that execution, the workflow execution status, right? And for example, let's say examples of columns that you can have in that table. It could be ID, status, attempts, the number of attempts. Next, retry. At, for example, you can say at 10:15 a.m. retry again, for example. Last error, you can track what was the last error you got when you tried. Payload reference and last execution ID, for example, right? So you kind of keep track of this information, this data, and it gives you everything you need to come back even later and trigger that retry because you have the execution ID, you know exactly what workflow failed, and then you can just trigger again that workflow and see if it completes successfully. And then you have the scheduler role, retry scheduler role, which essentially the role of the scheduler is to, it runs in the loop. You use a schedule node in N8N, for example, and you say, hey, every 5 minutes, go to this table, this ledger, and find any workflow that didn't execute and check if it's something that should be retried and retried, right? So it runs automatically. You don't have to do it manually. So that's the powerful thing, and that can be done at any time because you have that information in the database, right? Which this is something you don't have the wait node because the wait node is just working in that workflow execution. You don't have that information in a database to come back later and retry. If something happens with a wait node and if the N8N crashes, the workflow crashes, it's gone, it's lost. You lost the execution and it's not going to reach the CRM, it's not going to, and you might not have enough information to even detect that it failed. And then the client probably going to be complaining, I have a bunch of leads coming, but they not get into my CRM. And you have no idea what happened, right? So, and this is way stronger approach, this database back recovery ledger, because again, the state lives in the database, not only inside the execution.